In the grand halls of Caligula's palace, you wouldn't hear the sound of political debates or intellectual discourse. What echoed instead were the cries of desperation, pleas for mercy, and the shattering of human dignity. This wasn't a place of governance. It was a theater of suffering, where Rome's elite were reduced to mere puppets in a twisted show of power. Fathers auctioned off their daughters. Husbands smiled through tears as their wives were degraded, all of it carefully documented, not hidden. There were ledgers, receipts, and protocols, as if the cruelty was just another state expense. Caligula didn't just rule, he choreographed a system of institutionalized abuse. To truly understand how Rome reached this level of controlled depravity, we have to go back. Back to a time when a young man with an innocent smile was hailed as the savior of the empire. Before the cruelty, before the darkness, there was only hope. But hope is a fragile thing in the hands of a man who learned early on that in Rome, survival meant deception, and power, once unchecked, could twist even the most celebrated figure into the architect of one of history's most perverse regimes. Part 1 begins here and will follow in the next message. He was born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, but Rome came to know him as Caligula, the little soldier boy. As the son of the revered General Germanicus, he had the love of the legions from the very start. His childhood was spent in army camps, surrounded by soldiers who adored his father and treated young Caligula like their own. When Germanicus died under suspicious circumstances, rumors of poison whispered through every corner of Rome. It wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a warning. His family soon fell apart. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was exiled. His 2 older brothers were either executed or imprisoned. Caligula alone survived, but not by chance. He learned early how to become invisible, to act harmless and play the fool, all while absorbing the poisonous game of imperial politics. Raised under the watchful eye of Emperor Tiberius, he saw firsthand what unchecked paranoia could do. Tiberius was a man consumed by fear, a ruler who trusted no one and who transformed Capri into a fortress of suspicion. In that darkness, Caligula learned how to perform the perfect role, obedient, pleasant, never a threat. But beneath that quiet smile was a young man watching, remembering, and learning how to turn fear into a weapon. When Tiberius died in 37 CE, the empire rejoiced. Caligula stepped into power like a beam of sunlight, breaking through years of cold shadow. He did everything right at first. He reduced taxes, freed political prisoners, and organized dazzling public games that delighted the people. He built aqueducts and fixed roads, improving daily life for ordinary citizens. He even made sure the military was generously rewarded. Women threw flowers in his path. Children sang songs praising his name. Senators fought to be near him, eager to be seen smiling at Rome's new golden child. It was as if the golden age had returned. Caligula walked among the people, attended festivals, and sat beside senators at meals. He wasn't hiding away like Tiberius. He was present, charismatic, and adored. For a brief moment, Rome believed the gods had given them the perfect emperor. Then, in the autumn of that same year, everything changed. Caligula was struck by a sudden and terrifying illness. The fever was intense, his body shook uncontrollably, and he drifted in and out of delirium. For weeks he hovered near death. The court was thrown into panic. Priests made endless sacrifices, citizens promised their own lives in exchange for the emperor's, and finally he awoke. But he was no longer the same. At first the change was almost invisible. Then came the order. Every statue of every Roman god was to have its head replaced with his. He said it lightly, almost as a joke, but it was only the beginning. People noticed something in his eyes had gone cold. His gaze became distant, hungry, unnatural. He stopped sleeping. Servants would find him pacing through the halls at night, whispering to the moon, having one-sided conversations with marble gods, or digging in the palace gardens with his bare hands, claiming he was planting Rome's future. But what he truly planted that night was the root of an empire-wide nightmare. It began quietly within his own household. His three sisters, Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger, were no longer simply his siblings. They became pieces in the disturbing game he was beginning to play. He showed a particular obsession with Drusilla, calling her his goddess, his Diana. She appeared at events seated beside him as if she were his queen. And when she died suddenly in 38 CE, Caligula didn't just grieve, he fell apart. He declared a period of mourning so strict that laughter, bathing, and even family dinners were outlawed. Anyone caught smiling was executed. His pain was not the sorrow of a man who lost someone dear. It was the fury of a man who believed something that belonged to him had been stolen. And with Drusilla gone, he turned his attention outward to his other sisters and then to the noble families of Rome. And that's when the system began. It started like a game of influence. Caligula invited noblewomen to attend events, but these weren't ordinary gatherings. The emperor had a specially crafted golden seat positioned above a chamber that looked like a theater, but what took place there was far from performance. From his elevated position, he watched as Rome's high-born women were forced into degrading acts, not in secret, but with senators and guards as witnesses. Sometimes their own husbands were ordered to be present, instructed to smile, clap, or even offer praise, as if it were a show of talent and loyalty. Caligula watched closely, noting who hesitated, who complied, who smiled too eagerly. These notes weren't forgotten. They became weapons. Rewards or punishments followed based on those performances. Senators who obeyed found themselves suddenly favored. One man who responded eagerly to advances from Julia Livilla found his political career soaring overnight. Another, who showed disgust, woke up to find his only son missing. The child returned days later, mutilated beyond recognition. The message was unmistakable. In Caligula's Rome, neutrality was no longer an option. You were either useful or you were ruined. Even doctors weren't safe from involvement. Roman physician Lucius Scriba, in writings hidden for centuries, described how he was summoned by the emperor to examine noblewomen, girls and adults alike. He was ordered to evaluate their fertility, their physical resilience, and even how long they could endure being used repeatedly. These examinations were held in front of Caligula himself, who asked crude, humiliating questions about every detail of each woman's body. This wasn't mindless cruelty. It was calculated, official, and carried out with bureaucratic order. Fees were standardized. Each act had a price. A senator's wife, 16 tetradrachms. A virgin daughter, 2,000. Both together, 5,000. And this wasn't some under-the-table transaction. All payments went directly into the imperial treasury, recorded as if they were donations for the public good. There were no secrets here. It was a system dressed in ritual, wrapped in law, and enforced by power. Caligula turned the palace into what he called a temple of divine service. That wasn't a metaphor. He physically redesigned rooms, renamed them according to gods, and declared each one sacred. There was the room of Jupiter, where he enacted rituals to display his divine authority. Then came the chamber of Venus, where noble women were forced to reenact mythological scenes. There was even a hall of Priapus, a god of male fertility, where humiliations were carried out on those who had fallen from favor. These were no longer homes or courts. They had become stages for the emperor's ritualized domination. Lavish frescoes covered the walls, but they didn't show noble deeds or gods at war. They showed scenes that echoed what was done inside. These painted myths became templates for what happened to living bodies. Rome's elite reduced to actors in a never-ending ceremony of subjugation. Senators, once the proud voices of Rome's laws and values, now walked these corridors in silence, stepping over their dignity, praying they wouldn't be summoned next. This system was so detailed, so deeply built it ran like a government within the government. Women were given titles like vessels of service. They wore sheer robes, transparent silks imported from the East, marked with golden embroidery symbolizing which god's room they were assigned to. There were schedules, uniforms, ceremonial chants. Girls as young as 12 were inducted, told they were chosen for divine instruction. But these weren't teachings, they were rituals designed to erase resistance and turn innocence into compliance. Even that wasn't enough. Caligula began what can only be called a breeding program. Women deemed most fertile were forced to conceive children that would become wards of the state. These children, raised from birth in the palace, were trained to serve imperial needs. They didn't know their fathers. They didn't know freedom. Their whole lives were shaped to become part of this machine. Every conception, every miscarriage, and every infant death was logged, just like a military report. The corruption spread beyond women. Caligula didn't stop with mothers and daughters. He reached for the sons, too. Boys from Rome's patrician families were handpicked, removed from their homes, and transformed to fit the emperor's grotesque vision of obedience. These young boys were dressed in soft, transparent saffron tunics that clung to their frames. Their faces were painted with white powder and streaks of red, their voices trained to sound delicate, their movements rehearsed to mimic feminine grace. They weren't students. They were ornaments, trained pets paraded before the emperor and his guests. At Caligula's lavish banquets, these boys were brought out and made to serve more than food. Some were auctioned to the highest bidder for a night of humiliation. Others were given as rewards to soldiers or visiting dignitaries. The point was never pleasure, it was power. Caligula didn't care about desire. He cared about showing everyone that their bloodlines, their traditions, their pride, all could be twisted into something beneath him. Even worse, he made the families participate. Parents, once respected and powerful, were now assistants to their own downfall. Fathers signed documents giving over their daughters for service, pretending it was voluntary. Mothers lit ceremonial torches during parades, knowing the shame they were walking their children into. It wasn't just physical submission, it was moral collapse. A senator named Cornelius tried to resist. When ordered to hand over his wife Libya, he refused. In the Senate, he stood and publicly declined. That night, his 8-year-old son was found alive on the Senate steps, but mutilated, bearing a cruel message carved into his skin. The next day, Cornelius handed over Libya with trembling hands. Months later, when she became pregnant by imperial decree, Cornelius was forced to name the child as his own heir, denying all other children in his family. Rome's laws were bent to make shame official. One new statute declared that any child fathered by the emperor, regardless of the circumstances, held a higher status than any child born of lawful marriage. There were no boundaries left. Caligula had erased them all. To run this massive operation, he created a shadow administration. Just as Rome had officials for roads, taxes, and laws, this new machinery had its own clerks, guards, physicians, and scribes. Everything was recorded in meticulous detail: names, ages, ranks, physical descriptions, medical notes, prices paid, injuries endured, pregnancies confirmed. There were schedules for each participant, guards to escort them, and midwives trained to deliver children no one would ever call their own. Hundreds of people worked within this network. There were those who maintained the ceremonial garments. Others handled the fees. Some took notes, others cleaned the rooms. And everyone had a role that allowed them to say, "I was just doing my job." No one stood alone as the villain. That's what made the whole thing so dangerous. It was a collective system of complicity, designed so that no single person could be blamed, yet all were involved. On certain nights, Caligula turned his ceremonies into grand shows. During full moons, he held fertility rites in a private amphitheater converted into a grotesque pagan temple. Women were dressed like goddesses and matched with men or beasts chosen by the emperor himself. Gladiators, exotic captives, even trained animals were brought in. Every pairing, every moment was planned by Caligula with theatrical precision. He used a golden baton, decorated with phallic symbols, to command the show. From above, senators watched in silence, dressed in their finest robes, forced to smile while their wives and daughters were reduced to stage props. Scribal teams recorded every act, names, duration, signs of resistance, signs of enjoyment. It wasn't entertainment, it was ritualized humiliation. Pain was transformed into a kind of religious performance, and the emperor sat at the center of it all, feeding off the obedience of those too afraid to disobey. Outside the palace walls, a new market quietly bloomed. It wasn't a bazaar of spices or silks, but a black economy of pain. Apothecaries popped up in alleyways, offering ointments to ease bruising, herbs to numb memory, and illegal tonics to force miscarriages. Midwives worked in secret to end pregnancies that were never chosen. Surgeons specialized in repairing damage, not from war, but from ceremonies the emperor called sacred. Survivors who had been through the system paid to learn how to act, to smile, to obey, to seem unaffected. Obedience became a skill people were taught, bought and sold. Everyone around the palace profited. Everyone had a role. Everyone had a reason to stay silent. This made the entire structure unstoppable. Greed kept it running. So did fear. Ambition too. No one wanted to lose their status, their wealth, or their family. So poets wrote verses that made Caligula look like a divine ruler, spinning horror into myth. Merchants welcomed senators with bloody coins, knowing full well where the money came from. Priests gave blessings over marriages that were never real. Every layer of Roman society dipped its hands in this system. And the worst part was, it paid too well to resist. The official histories didn't write down what those bodies lived through, but the victims didn't need words. Their bodies remembered. Their silence spoke louder than any scream. Bellies swelled with unwanted life. Faces stiffened into masks. Some victims stopped speaking altogether. One senator's daughter, Valeria, simply went silent after months of abuse. Doctors confirmed her vocal cords worked, but she had lost the will to speak. Her silence became contagious. Other girls avoided her gaze, not because they hated her, but because they saw their own future in her empty stare. Caligula's cruelty wasn't wild or random. It was systematic. A new ritual began, forcing mothers to witness what was done to their daughters. Sometimes, after watching, the mothers were then ordered to repeat the same acts, reversing roles as their daughters looked on. Caligula narrated these horrors like a poet reciting a tragic myth. He spoke softly, with elegance, as if he were telling a story of gods, not ruining human lives. In his twisted mind, he believed he was continuing ancient myths, those tales where gods took whatever they wanted, however they wanted. Where Zeus came in the form of beasts, where mortals were playthings, but Caligula didn't need disguise. He used law, he used ritual, he used Rome's own customs to turn godlike violence into government. What the old myths did with metaphor, he did with bureaucracy. And people followed, not because they wanted to, but because resistance almost always led to death. Some tried. Some stole poisons from gardens. Others burned their faces, hoping that disfigurement might protect them. A few tried to cut deep enough to die. But the palace had skilled doctors trained in restoring beauty, saving lives, and dragging the unwilling back to their sacred duties. For those whose scars made them unwanted by others, Caligula declared them still useful. Ugliness, he said, made the ritual more pure. In his view, beauty wasn't necessary, only submission. There was no escape. Informants were everywhere. Those who tried to flee were found by secret guards, dragged back and made examples of. Sometimes their entire families were punished. A runaway daughter meant a disgraced father, a mutilated brother, or a mother forced to stand in her place. The palace records grew thicker with each passing month. There were now thousands of files. Each had a code, a category, and a list of names. Every detail was recorded: the act, the participant, the cost, the result. Paperwork was endless, an empire of forms, ledgers, and approvals. Each crime became part of a neat official book. Evil was documented, catalogued, and made legal. Caligula often read from these records in the Senate. In a soft voice, he would pick random names and describe in chilling detail what had happened to someone's wife or daughter, forcing the men to listen, unable to protest. There was no one who could pretend not to know any more. Caligula made sure of that. The crimes weren't whispered in dark corridors. They were read aloud under marble domes. Senators sat frozen while the emperor, with theatrical flair, flipped through official records and recited the exact time, length, and number of participants involved in a noblewoman's humiliation. Entry 346, he might say. Julia, wife of Marcus Antonius. 4 hours. 6 participants. Pregnancy confirmed. And Marcus, like all the others, would be forced to nod, eyes fixed on the floor, mouth shut. This wasn't just punishment. It was the emperor branding memory into the minds of Rome's most powerful. A collective shame, a shared silence. He was making sure that no one could forget, because forgetting meant pretending it had never happened. And Caligula wanted everyone to remember exactly what absolute power looked like when it bared its teeth. Even his personal guards, the elite Praetorian Guard, were pulled into the system. They were not just bystanders. They were key players. Guards escorted victims, stood watch during rituals, and in many cases participated directly in the ceremonies. The emperor rewarded them with victims after his own use. Caligula didn't just want loyalty, he wanted shared guilt. The deeper he could drag others into his crimes, the more control he had. If everyone was stained, then no one could stand above him. One guard named Cassius Chaerea became a central figure in what came next. He was a veteran soldier, hardened by years of battle, respected by his peers. But Caligula singled him out for torment. He mocked his voice, insulted his manhood, gave him ridiculous tasks designed to humiliate him in front of others. At first, Chaerea endured it, silent and cold. But something inside him began to break. He didn't become kind. He didn't become noble. What cracked open was fury, rage at the endless humiliation, rage at watching others suffer while he was made to laugh. Then came the emperor's final plan, the ceremony he called his masterpiece. It was scheduled for the evening of January 24th, 41 CE, a spectacle like no other. Wives of senators would be auctioned off in front of their husbands. They would compete not in games but in submission. Numbers were called out like livestock. 20, 30, 40. The bodies moved in hollow unison, the sparkle in their eyes long gone. The arena was transformed into a stage of surrender, a place where pain wore the mask of ritual. But the emperor never got to see the end. The next day, as Caligula walked through a narrow passage under the theater, a group of conspirators was waiting. Led by Chaerea, they didn't hesitate. The first stab was followed by dozens more. Blood pooled on the marble floor. One blow, deliberate and brutal, struck directly at the emperor's genitals, a symbolic reversal of everything he had inflicted on others. There was no mercy, no hesitation. The guards who had once protected him were the same hands that tore him down, but the end of Caligula did not mean the end of the system. His wife, Milonia Caesonia, was killed shortly after. His daughter, Julia Drusilla, barely more than a child, was also murdered. The conspirators believed that the dynasty itself had to be erased. It wasn't just about removing a ruler. It was about killing the idea he had planted, that power had no limits. Still, death could not undo what had already been done. After Caligula's death, the Senate rushed to erase his memory. Statues were dragged from public spaces, their heads smashed or thrown into the Tiber. Inscriptions bearing his name were scraped from stone. Coins with his image were melted down, reduced to untraceable metal. The new emperor, Claudius, issued a formal damnatio memoriae, an official act to strip Caligula from history, to act as if he had never ruled at all. But memory isn't stone or metal. It lives in scars, in silence, in the things people can't say but can never forget. The children born from the emperor's breeding program didn't disappear. They grew up inside the palace system or were sent quietly into the homes of loyalists. Many were never told who their parents were. Some were adopted into high-ranking families. Others vanished into temple service or military ranks, carrying with them bloodlines born not of love, but of power and ritualized violence. These children had no roots and no real past, only secrets buried deep within them, and sometimes questions that no one dared answer. The victims aged, but they didn't heal. Women who had once been proud daughters and wives became shadows, withdrawing from public life. Some stopped speaking altogether, like Valeria. Others wore layers of clothing to hide what had been done to them. They raised children that weren't their husbands, and were forced to smile at court functions, pretending nothing had ever happened. Their husbands, once powerful senators, could no longer meet their gaze. They had lit the torches, signed the documents, smiled through the ceremonies. Now they lived in shame too heavy to name. The men who once justified the system, claiming it was divine will or patriotic duty, tried to return to normal politics. But they were never the same. Every law they passed, every speech they gave, was stained by what they had once accepted, even applauded. They had helped build the machine, and though the head had been cut off, the body still twitched. The laws Caligula used to justify his reign, the rituals, the religious language, the bureaucratic processes didn't vanish. They stayed in the empire's bones, ready to be reactivated by any ruler with a cruel imagination. The ledgers Caligula kept were never fully destroyed. Some were hidden, others were used quietly, not as blackmail anymore, but as reference for who had supported what, who had stayed silent, and who could still be controlled. These records showed exactly how far people were willing to go when the law told them evil was divine and obedience was virtue. What Caligula left behind wasn't just trauma. It was a manual, a blueprint for how to turn cruelty into administration, violation into ceremony, and perversion into power. He didn't just rule through fear. He built a structure that made fear profitable, participation routine, and morality irrelevant. That's what frightened Rome most in the years after. That even though the man was gone, the system remained dangerously reusable. And the darkest part, no one knew how many others had copied parts of it already. After Caligula's fall, many believed that wiping away his name would be enough to heal the empire. They thought if they broke his statues and melted his coins, the rot he had spread would disappear too. But they were wrong. You can erase a face from a monument, but you can't erase what people remember when they close their eyes at night. In quiet rooms, behind heavy curtains, survivors spoke in whispers, if they spoke at all. Daughters tried to forget what was done to them. Mothers tried to explain the unexplainable. Fathers sat in silence, pretending their shame wasn't there. Rome had changed. The city's buildings still stood, but something deeper had cracked. A sense of safety, of decency, of unspoken rules that once separated men from monsters, those were gone. In the years that followed, some of the same families who had once paraded in Caligula's rituals tried to re-enter public life. They dressed up their daughters again, arranged marriages, hosted festivals, and prayed that no one remembered. But people did remember. Behind the smiles and polished marble homes, there were memories that wouldn't die. Everyone knew who had participated. Everyone knew who had handed over their children. The children themselves were reminders. Some had the emperor's features, his sharp chin, his cold stare. Others carried his legacy in ways more painful. Girls born of violence, trained in silence, grew up not knowing how to be daughters or wives. Boys raised inside the palace's system never learned what real family meant. These young people were taught to serve, not to live. Their entire sense of worth was shaped by what the empire once demanded from their bodies. And then there were the ledgers. Not all were destroyed. Some scribes kept copies, hidden beneath floorboards or sealed in family tombs. Some were used by the next regime, not to punish, but to keep control. Knowledge is power, and these records revealed exactly how far each senator, each priest, each merchant had gone to protect their place under Caligula's reign. That knowledge didn't die with him. It became another tool, the idea of what the emperor created, that power could touch anything, ruin anyone, and still be legal, haunted Rome. Caligula had taught the elite a brutal truth. All it takes is one man with no limits and a system willing to obey. And once those boundaries are shattered, they don't return so easily. Claudius, the next emperor, tried to distance himself. He blamed everything on Caligula, painted him as mad, a mistake of history. But Claudius never reopened investigations. He never punished the guards. He didn't shut down the secret rituals or offer healing to the victims. Instead, he focused on moving forward, keeping the empire stable. In doing so, he preserved the silence. He gave survivors no voice. He gave families no justice. The machine had been switched off, but its parts were still in place, quiet, waiting. So Rome moved on, at least on the surface, but underneath the marble streets and well-dressed senators, something rotten remained. The victims carried their pain in hidden ways. Many never spoke of what happened. Some took their own lives years later. Others simply vanished. And the men who once enforced those rituals, many kept rising. They weren't disgraced. They were promoted. They had shown loyalty, and in Rome, loyalty was everything. What Caligula did was far more dangerous than ruling with cruelty. He turned cruelty into a system that didn't die with him. A system that showed the world just how easily people could be trained to accept the unacceptable. Years passed, but the shadow Caligula cast never truly faded. The empire he ruled tried to pretend it had healed. Festivals returned. The Senate debated as if nothing had happened. Gladiators clashed in the Colosseum. New emperors came and went, each one claiming to restore dignity, tradition, and strength. But deep beneath the marble surface of Rome, a sickness lingered, a quiet understanding that power, once abused so openly, could never be fully caged again. The system Caligula created didn't need his name to survive. It had already been absorbed by the structure of empire. Forms were still filled. Records still kept. Guards still trained to follow orders without question. Laws that once justified his rituals were never fully repealed, only ignored until needed again. The machinery remained intact, waiting for someone bold enough to turn it back on, and people remembered. Victims grew old with sealed mouths and haunted eyes. They watched their grandchildren run through the streets of Rome and prayed they'd never understand the things they had seen. But memories passed down in small ways, unexplained fears, strange silences, sudden flinches, scars not always on the skin, but carried in posture, in quiet refusals to trust, to speak, to believe in the safety of love. Some of the children born from that system never knew their origins, but others pieced together clues: why they didn't look like their siblings, why their fathers kept them at a distance, why their mothers wept when they smiled. A few tried to learn the truth. They found scraps of records, half-burned names, whispered confessions from dying servants. What they uncovered wasn't just personal. It was Rome's deepest shame. A shame too vast to fit into any monument, too cruel to be honored by a statue or poem. As the empire grew, spanning continents, building wonders and writing history, it also carried this legacy, hidden under its greatness like a crack in the foundation. The same senators who once clapped for Caligula's ceremonies went on to shape laws and advise future emperors. The same guards who dragged women through temple corridors stood proudly in parade lines, their medals glinting in the sun. Rome celebrated itself, but some of its riches came from pain it refused to acknowledge, and the manual, the instructions Caligula left behind on how to turn humans into tools, suffering into spectacle, and fear into obedience. It didn't vanish. It was studied, copied, and passed on in whispers. Administrators in future courts adapted parts of it. Not always in the same form, not always as openly. But the essence remained: power without limits, systems without mercy, cruelty that could be justified if enough people agreed to look away. In the end, Caligula didn't just die. He became a warning, ignored by some, feared by others, but always present. His death ended a man, but the wounds he left lived on in every victim, every ledger, every silence that followed. The empire marched forward, but behind it, dragging like a chain, was the legacy of a ruler who proved that the worst kind of evil isn't wild or chaotic. It's the kind that wears robes, speaks in laws, and smiles while rewriting the meaning of worship, duty, and love, Let me know if you'd like a title image, voiceover style script, or scene adaptation of this story.